Hi there, and welcome to the 2016 Millennial Impact Report media webinar. I'm Amy Thayer, and I'm the Director of Research here at Achieve, and I'll also be your host for the next 20 to 30 minutes or so as we reveal our final and conclusive findings for the 2016 Millennial Impact Report. Thank you all for joining, and as we go through, just a reminder that these data are not new. They are data that have been collected from between March of 2016 through post-election 2016, and this report is not releasing any new findings, albeit just new conclusions and new recommendations based on the entire study's data that we've collected over the past almost year or so. Before we move ahead, I want to give a big shout out to the Case Foundation, who since the beginning of the study, which was 2009, has provided excellent partnership for us and supported the Millennial Impact Research Project. And the Case Foundation invests in people and ideas that can change the world. And for nearly 2 decades, they have focused on creating programs and investing in people and organizations that address urgent social challenges. And without the support of the Case Foundation, the Millennial Impact Project would not be possible. So thank you so much to them. So before we embark on our final findings and conclusions for the 2016 study, I think it's important to really talk about a few definitions as we move along and I present the data so you have an idea of how it is in context and how we asked it over the course of the study. The first definition really is focused on political ideology. And for our survey, what we asked respondents was on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is the most liberal leaning that you could define your political ideology, all the way through 100, which would be the most conservative leaning ideology that one could have, where they place themselves on this continuum. And so just to note that 0 is the most liberal leaning, 100 is the most conservative leaning political ideology, and the neutral or the middle point is 50. And so when we talk about data as they relate to this particular question, that gives you a sense of how folks, they self-reported on being one end of the spectrum or the other. The other definition that's important to talk about is how we defined, excuse me, the other important definition to talk about is how we define social media engagement. And that related to a respondent's activity through social media platforms, which refers to either their own posts or their comments on or their retweets of other people's posts. So there are a few data points that we want to point out that relate to social media engagement. And so we just think that it is important for you to understand how these questions were asked and to what they refer. And so again, before the hypothesis, it's really important to talk about the Millennial Impact Report has really been examining the how and why of millennials' engagement with social causes for the last 5 years. And this year, the 6th year of the study, was really a critical time point because we had never quite looked at how millennials engage with causes during a US presidential election. And we wanted to understand how the election influenced millennials' attitudes towards cause engagement. And so this provided a prime opportunity. Never could we have imagined what the political season would have looked like this past year. And so it made it very ripe for some of our questioning and interview methodologies that we use to talk to millennials and trying to understand how a political season and how politics may or may not have affected their cause engagement. And so in looking at this, the first hypothesis that we had was we believe that millennials' cause engagement or their interest in causes would change based on their individual political ideology and the ways in which they align themselves, the final candidates that they chose to represent those ideologies, and then finally the major social causes that were associated both with the candidates and the ideologies that they align themselves. And what we found was it really didn't change. It remained very constant. In fact, education began and remained as the top social issue of concern throughout our entire study. And so that's from monthly surveys conducted in March through November. Education remained the #1 cause. Our second hypothesis, hypothesis number 2, was that millennials' cause-related engagement would increase through social media platforms, that being online activism, if you will, and also in direct or physical support of causes, and that being by the means of volunteering, donating, signing petitions, and what most people refer to as traditional activism. And what we found here too was their interest in social causes really didn't change appreciably during the political season. And what we found was that cause-related engagement really didn't increase on those platforms, either in person or online. And we found no associations between this particular time period and the level of millennials' cause-related engagement. But what we learned from the overall study is really worth pointing out here. And so these are sort of the high-level things that came out of our research. Millennials are quietly yet powerfully redefining terms such as cause engagement, liberal, conservative, activist. And the way that we looked at that and what the data revealed were that cause engagement, liberal, conservative, these are all definitions that traditionally people have an idea of what they mean. But what we found when we spoke to both millennials and surveyed millennials was that these definitions don't really apply to them. They want to either change or eradicate, redefine these types of labels that are being applied to them. And in large part, it seemed to be because of their everyday living. Activism is something that they don't really go out and do. It's a part of their life. And so that's something that came through in the data and in our findings. Number two, millennials expect the government to be less divisive, and they want to see the government to help accommodate the increasingly open-mindedness of America. There were previously contentious social issues, but millennials really wanted the government to help with that forward thinking and with that open-mindedness as it relates to social issues. And finally, millennials aren't loyal to political parties, but instead they were more loyal to the issues and the causes that they were passionate about, that they cared about. And then the candidates that they believed that best spoke to these issues and causes, those are the people that they tended to align themselves with. So we have the opening to this is not your parents' activism, right? It's not the activism of your parents' day. And so what that really means is when we ask millennials, how much do you agree with the following statement? I am an activist, a person who behaves intentionally to bring about political or social change. What we found was that only about half of the millennials surveyed agreed with that. And the ones that did agree, it really wasn't too strongly either. And so we couldn't figure out why the millennials, who are known for the do-gooding generation, known for going out and acting on behalf of causes that they are passionate about, why do only half of them see themselves as activists? And here's a quote from one of our interviews with a millennial respondent who says, I see an activist along the lines of a protester, so I can't say that I consider myself one of those. In a small way, I have no problem voicing my opinion to my congressman or signing a petition, but I really wouldn't consider myself an activist. And this is a theme that we saw throughout our study. As I said, thinking of this generation as a do-gooding generation and going out and acting on behalf of causes to create social change, they didn't really consider themselves an activist. And as we entered into phase two, the qualitative phase of the research study, some of these interview quotes really helped to extrapolate why they didn't consider themselves an activist. So the second theme that really resonated and really emerged from the data was their trust in government. They really don't have a lot of trust in government to do what's right and to work on their behalf. And so as you see here, about 75% of respondents had a very low level trust in government. And when you break that out by race and ethnicity, you can see that there are varying levels of trust. For instance, Caucasians, Hispanics, and African Americans ranked trust in government only a little. That was the highest percentage category for all three of those groups. And then when you looked at Asians as a part of our study actually tended to rank some trust in government as the highest category, whereas African Americans ranked trust in government a lot, the lowest of all the groups. So almost a full 11 percentage points behind Caucasian and Hispanics, African Americans indicated that they trusted the government the least. And so that is an important finding as we go along to see, so if millennials have very low trust in government, how, in fact, are they going about affecting change on behalf of causes that are interest of them? And we'll see that in subsequent slides here. When thinking about trust in government as it corresponds with larger social issues and with causes that millennials are passionate about, you can see here folks that had the strongest levels of trust in government also reported causes of interest being disaster relief, international issues, arts and culture, as well as transportation. So basically what the slide is trying to indicate is that folks who had the strongest levels of trust in government also supported these four causes the most strongly. Conversely, when you look at folks who had the least trust in government or no trust at all in government, you can see that the issues that they most supported were more of a personal nature. And so what this seems to suggest is that millennials have faith in government or have trust in government as it applies to more institutional types of causes, more institutional and traditional causes. However, when they look at the issues and causes that are really of interest to them personally, they don't really believe that the government can do a whole lot to help advance awareness and help advance the plight of those causes. So the political ideology question that I referenced at the beginning, the sliding scale from 0 to 100, and for millennials to indicate which end of the spectrum they saw themselves most leaning. Very interesting findings here. Throughout our study, we really did find that millennials, more than not, indicated that they lean slightly more conservative. And so on a scale, sliding scale of very liberal to very conservative, you can see on the far right side, the very conservatives a little bit higher than the folks on the very far left end of the spectrum. But by and large, most millennials place themselves in the neutral zone, we'll call it. And so, as you can see, just to the right of 50% and just to the left of 50%, or a 50-point marking, are the highest percentages. And so, although more millennials in our study indicated that they leaned more conservatively than liberal, you can see the vast majority of our respondents really ended up quite in the middle. And so our findings from both the qualitative interviews and the qualitative approach and the quantitative approach, which are our survey responses, showed that political parties are lessening of importance to the millennials, and they don't quite have the trust that they once had, probably with older generations. And so millennials as a cohort can't really be characterized as liberal or conservative, right? As individuals and as a group, they hold positions from both sides of the aisle. And so when we conducted the qualitative approach section of this study, what we found out was millennials really held, for example, perhaps they have very strong beliefs on the fiscal side, where they consider themselves very fiscally conservative. And then they had strong beliefs on a socially liberal side. And at the end of the day, when they decided who they would vote for, it really was determined by which one of those beliefs was more strongly held by that particular individual. So if they had stronger conservative fiscal views, they tended to vote for the Republican candidate. If they had stronger liberal views, they tended to vote for the Democratic candidate. And so, as I said, the interesting part about looking at why millennials might not trust government to create change, what is the juxtaposition? How to that belief? How are they going to go out and affect change? They actually believe that they themselves hold the power to create change as individuals or as a group of collective individuals. So when you look at this slide, in aggregate, more than 70% felt that they had the capacity to improve issues they care about. So they weren't relying on traditional or historically institutional groups to carry out the work of causes that they were passionate about. They believed in themselves to be able to do that. And so when you look at it by race and ethnicity, this is important to really parcel out. So across the board, nearly 70% of all four groups, Asians being a little bit lower, but in general, almost 70% across the board believe that they could affect change. Now, this is particularly interesting when you look at the Black African American respondents. They're strong at 70%, not far behind Hispanic or whites at all. However, they were the folks that had the least trust in government to affect change. But I think the important point to point out here is that they, in fact, believe that they themselves can affect change. So change can still occur. It's just not along the more traditional avenues and paths that we have seen in the past. So when we talk about what does motivate millennials to engage in cause work, what we found is it's really not different than a lot of the findings we've had previously in the Millennial Impact projects. It's an intrinsic desire to help a cause that they're interested in. It's not loyalty to an organization. It's not belief in an individual candidate or in a political party. It really is their own intensive desire, their own personal desire to support an organization or a cause of their choice. And so across the board, regardless of age, geography, income, the candidate that the individual supported, or their self-identified political ideology, you can see the top issues were education, employment, healthcare, and the economy. Now, the interesting part about this is that when you looked at millennials' engagement in particular causes, they really didn't fall under these three categories, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. They were much more personal causes, and so this is sort of the macro level, and they seem to be things that affect millennials as a generational cohort rather than individuals who are working on behalf of causes that they are passionate about. When we talk about social media is something that everybody's been interested in. I think with millennials, they're known to be the digitally connected generation. And so we really wanted to understand, how do they use or how do they leverage social media to become involved in cause engagement? And if you remember from the beginning, one of our hypotheses was that they would in fact increase their social media engagement. And that actually we found to not be true. as you can see here, social media was really used to investigate, to educate themselves, to obtain knowledge about particular candidates, about particular candidates' political beliefs, about candidates' particular interests and causes, and how they would behave to act on behalf or not on behalf of particular causes. And so when we asked the question about social media, what we found is that Facebook was actually the most high used social media platform. At 87% of folks used Facebook, followed by Twitter at 54%, and then Instagram at 47%. And so what we wanted to understand, are they using these platforms to be very politically active, to really stand out and discuss their views? And what we found was they really weren't. The qualitative interviews really seemed to suggest that they use social media as a means to garner information. Now, they would perhaps at times post things that they had found and retweet things that other people said, but they weren't really posting their opposition to things. Those kinds of confrontations, if you will, or discussions really were handled in person and not via social media. Interestingly, too, males use social media far more than females in nearly every category that we talked about, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat. But the interesting piece to come out of the social media questioning was really that they did not use it as a platform to engage in opposition and arguments on either side of the political spectrum. And so what we found is that the issue actually influenced the method of participation. And so as you see here, less than half of millennials volunteered on behalf of a cause. But for those who did participate, you can see they participated in via petitioning, using social media as a platform, again, retweeting, posting information that they had found on behalf of a particular cause or candidate, and then also engaging in community projects. Now, this is interesting because we've had a lot of questions about what kind of millennials are these? Is this a certain faction of your respondents? It is, but these findings were irrespective of somebody's geographical location, their age, or the candidate that they supported. And as I said earlier, when we looked at the overarching issues that were of concern to millennials, you'll remember it was education, economy, healthcare. But although education was the top issue, and that was the one that remained constant throughout the entire study, they chose to volunteer, charitably give, and also participate in community action projects, most often on behalf of disaster relief, and environmental causes also ranked high for donations. But as you look at this chart, of the 43% of millennials that volunteered, they did so on behalf of disaster relief, international issues, arts and culture, transportation, and then education comes in fifth, which was the highest ranking overarching issue that they indicated all along. So we can see, again, the personal aspect of it. These are also issues that were quite prevalent in the news media throughout the election cycle due to current events and environmental issues that were happening across the globe. So when we think about demographics, this is another question we often have. Do these behaviors sort of diverge based on folks' characteristics and individual characteristics and demographics? And so what we found was those with lower participation rates in petitioning and community engagement and social media use tended to be the younger millennials. They hovered sort of in that 50 range where they weren't very decisive on whether they consider themselves conservative or liberal. They had lower education levels. They tended to earn less or become employed less often. They also had a weaker belief in their ability to affect change. So those people that ranked themselves pretty low on being able to go out and affect change, they also had lower participation rates, understandably. I think that makes sense. And they also had less trust in government. And so that's an interesting factor when you pull that out. They had less participation rates in petitioning because they didn't really trust the government or the institution, perhaps, to do what they wanted them to do on behalf of them. And then rounding out that list, folks who lived in urban areas also tended to have lower rates of participation. So when you look at candidates that the millennial respondents indicated they would vote for, across the board, you can see that by race or ethnicity, every category indicated that most of them would vote for Hillary Clinton, which is an interesting finding because, again, as I said, across month over month, we found that these millennial respondents indicated that they had a more conservative-leaning ideology. But when they went to the voting booth, they indicated that they would vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, what we'll find later is that shifted just a bit, as indicated by our post-election surveys. But going into the election, most groups indicated that they would vote for Hillary Clinton. Interestingly, this group was on the high side of indicating that they would vote, 78% actually indicated that they voted in the 2016 presidential election out of the 84% who also reported that they had registered. And so the folks who were not in these categories tended to indicate that they had apathy towards the process, apathy towards the candidates that were there, distrust of the electoral system. Many people looked to that to say their vote really didn't matter because we relied on the Electoral College to indicate the number of votes. And then again, a lot of people stayed home because they just didn't like both candidates. In fact, one millennial respondent said that a vote for the lesser of two evils is still a vote for evil. So you can see they were very deliberate on why they did not come out and vote. So this was probably one of the most interesting findings of our study. Pre-election, 20% indicated that they would vote for Donald Trump. Post-election, we found out that 40% actually indicated that they did. Now, this is very on par with what happened in the general election. And so although we were surprised by this finding, again, the fact that our millennial respondents indicated that they were more conservative-leaning sort of indicated that this could potentially happen, but 20% higher actually voted than said they would vote was a surprising finding for us. Okay, and so when we break it down by gender, when you look at male millennials versus female millennials in our study, you can see that far more females consider themselves liberal-leaning, whereas more males consider themselves conservative-leaning. And then the juxtaposition between males and females in each one of these categories is quite marked. So whereas males were about 38% at their peak in wave one, across the study you had 48%, full 10 percentage points of female millennials indicating they would vote or that they consider themselves more liberal-leaning. So when we asked about the activist question, another important fact was 15% fewer female millennials and male millennials described themselves as activists. This was surprising to us on one hand, but also seemed to resemble other research that had been done between male and female voters and men and women across the U.S. in previous research studies. So in our millennial impact studies, we have found that females are far more engaged in cause engagement activities, that being charitable giving, donating, community organizing. But in a political round during a political season, we found that females were less engaged. And so that sort of seems to indicate why we found out that they had a lower or weaker belief in their own ability to affect change. And they were also far less engaged in each one of those activities, petitioning, community engagement, and also volunteerism. But the interesting part is, and this goes back to the fact that they really want to eradicate or redefine some of the labels that are applied to them. As one female millennial said, I definitely want to try and get out and get more involved. I just haven't found the right way. And then upon further investigation and talking to her in an interview, she indicated all the different things that she does on behalf of some of the causes that she is passionate about. And so what that seems to suggest, again, is the eradication of those labels. Don't really see themselves as activists because it's probably just something that they do in their everyday lives. It's a part of who they are. So this brings us to our final recommendations and conclusions. So conclusion one, all the data in aggregate and all the different waves that we looked at along with the interview data seem to suggest that millennials stay loyal to the causes that they are passionate about, those personal causes that they act as advocates for, while also supporting the overarching issues of their generation, such as education, the economy, issues of healthcare. And so our recommendation for organizations and for folks wanting to engage millennials, we would say within these larger social issues, causes must give millennials and individuals the chance to see their impact immediately. They want to go and volunteer. They want to sign petitions, right? We saw that they did that, but they have to be able to do it on behalf of a cause that is important to them. So if it is within one of these overarching causes, it needs to be a bit more personal for them. The second conclusion is that millennials seek to create change and make difference through individualistic and personally gratifying actions, and in a way that eradicates the traditional cause labels, as we talked about. They don't see themselves as activists. They don't trust the government as much as perhaps previous generations have done, and so they really want to work among themselves. They believe that they themselves can make a change, and when working on behalf of a cause or working to create social change, they tend to work in smaller, more micro groups. Friends of theirs, community groups that they're involved with, even so much as working with children in their household to help educate and help them understand how they can go out and create change. So it's a much more personal behavioral and much more personal stance than perhaps we've seen in the past. So the second recommendation is just to realize that millennials are sophisticated. They're savvy about where they obtain their information, and they're very educated consumers and cause supporters. They also have multiple interests, as we saw, international issues, environmental issues, issues of education. So they have multiple ways in which they become engaged in the causes of interest to them. And so what we would say is you really need to get to know them to be able to interact with them on a personal level if you want to allow them to be the most powerful advocates on behalf of a cause that you may work with. And so the final conclusion is that millennials believe in themselves to create change, again, not the institutions, and they work within their peer networks, as I suggested before. And so it's not these grandiose behaviors on behalf of causes. It's really something that they do that is meaningful to them and resonates to them personally. And then if it's something they believe in, they reach out to their peer groups on behalf of that particular cause to enlist their support so that they can go as a unified group, if you will. And so our last recommendation too is then to offer the engagement opportunities more thoughtfully and deliberately, in knowing that millennials are using their peer-to-peer networks and that they want to feel good about what they're doing on behalf of a cause of interest to them. They really need to understand that they are making a difference and they're doing it with an immediate impact. It's not something that's going to be seen in generations to come, although that does seem to be an important thought to them. They want to see immediate change, and so they're willing to work on behalf of that. And so if you can provide opportunities that really speak to that, that is one way that you can get them involved. So what's ahead? In wrapping up here, our final presentation of the 2016 Millennial Impact Report will be at South by Southwest this Friday. At that time, the final report will also be released to the public. Next year, in the 2017 Millennial Impact Report, we'll begin investigating social issues and social justice issues of interest to millennials. A lot of that has been driven by the findings of the 2016 report. And so in closing, I want to sincerely thank you for attending today's webinar. You'll be receiving an embargoed copy of the report here shortly. And if you want any other information about previous or past Millennial Impact projects, you can visit themillennialimpact.com. And finally, if you have any questions or interview requests for myself or Derek Feldman, who's also been involved with the Millennial Impact Project and Millennial Impact Report, you can certainly email marketing@achieveagency.com. Thank you so much for attending. We look forward to talking to you soon.